Meetings are resumed. Please be seated.
Government business, bills, first readings. The Immigration Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for a second reading.
The Advanced Passenger Information Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The National Honors and Awards Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for a second reading.
The Utility Regulation and Competition Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Information and Communication Technology Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Traffic Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Liquor Licensing Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Music and Dancing Control Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and set down for the second reading.
The Cadet Corps Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Law Reform Commission Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read a first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Criminal Procedure Code Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read a first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Disaster Preparedness and Hazard Management Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Electricity Sector Regulation Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Water Sector Regulation Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Water Authority Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Conditional Release Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Trade Union Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
Second readings. The Immigration Amendment Bill 2018.
The Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill shortly entitled the Immigration Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the member wish to speak thereto? Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, quite extensively. If I could have a lectern, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill which I have just moved proposes to do a number of things to improve the overall administration of the immigration regime in these islands And some of the changes, Mr. Speaker, reflect concerns expressed by various members in this House, including notably two members in the opposition, the honourable member from East End and honourable member from Savannah, changes which they proposed, or I should say issues which they highlighted to this House. In one case some years ago, and in the other more recently. Mr. Speaker, the amendment bill seeks to extend the same powers, functions, duties, rights, privileges, and immunities to the Chief Immigration Officer to the newly created and appointed position of Interim Director of the Workforce Opportunities and Residency Cayman Department, which we are calling WORK for short, with the exception of those powers contained in Parts 6, 7, and 8, and Sections 103 and 111 of Part 9 of the law. It also, Mr. Speaker, seeks to remove the time limits for certain persons to apply for the right to be Caymanian. And by that I mean, Mr. Speaker, where there were, to use an expression which has been used before, sunset provisions, that you couldn't apply after a certain point or after you became a certain age. To provide for the establishment of a Refugee Protection Appeals Tribunal to hear appeals relating to the refusal of the grant of asylum in these islands, to address the issue relating to spouses of Caymanians and qualifications to apply for naturalization as British Overseas Territories citizenship, and to alter the eligibility requirements of the Certificate for Specialist Caregivers. Mr. Speaker, the proposals put forward in this bill reflect the government's commitment to continuing to enhance existing immigration facilities and streamline processes that are directly related to Caymanians and their dependents. We are all aware, Mr. Speaker, that these issues that the bill seeks to address have been of grave concern in our community for many years. As a result, the bill seeks to provide legislative provisions to address these anomalies and thereby support the right to family life. Mr. Speaker, I wish to state for the record that this government supports all efforts that work toward promoting economic stability, prosperity, and progress for this country. In fact, the National Unity Government is committed to supporting the journey of building effective workforce capability among Caymanians in conjunction with delivering an efficient, fair, and transparent work permit and permanent residency regime that does not disenfranchise Caymanians in their pursuit of employment and economic opportunities or career advancement. As such, Mr. Speaker, the government will continue with further legislative reforms to enable the realization of our vision for full employment among Caymanians who are able and willing to work. Mr. Speaker, I now propose to explain some of the improvements this bill proposes to make that collectively seek to update the existing provisions of the immigration law. In terms of workforce development, with the establishment of the Work Department and the appointment of its interim director, it is now necessary to extend the relevant powers required to facilitate the interim director to deliver the functions and responsibilities of the post with regards to managing the work permit regime. I would like to highlight, Mr. Speaker, that since the appointment of the interim director, she has been actively engaged in leading the transformation of workforce development, work permits, and residency to to deliver on the government's priorities to create a customer-centric, modern, efficient, fair, and transparent process. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the provisions contained in Clause 3 of the bill provide that the interim director will have the same powers, duties, functions, rights, privileges, and immunities as the chief immigration officer, except for those parts of the immigration law related to entry and landing, which are in Part 6, asylum, Part 7, and deportation, Part 8, and Sections 103 and 111 of Part 9, which respectively concern authorization to carry arms and duties of an immigration officer. Mr. Speaker, this provision will enable the interim director to provide greater strategic oversight, operational direction, and administrative decision-making to maintain continuity of operations while simultaneously shaping and delivering a complex transformation of our work permit and residency system. By extension, this provision will enable the acting chief immigration officer to focus his time and apply his expertise in relation to the change management process of merging aspects of the Customs Department and the Immigration Department to create an integrated border protection agency. Mr. Speaker and fellow members of the Legislative Assembly, we are all painfully aware of the ghost Caymanian issue, as it has come to be called, an issue which was raised squarely in this House by the member from East End not so long ago, which mainly relates to persons who were but are no longer Caymanian by entitlement. The term has also been used to refer to persons who were born in these islands between the 27th of March 1977 and the 1st of January 1983, who are British Overseas Territory citizens by virtue of their birth in these islands, and who, despite being born here, have never been legally Caymanian. In both scenarios, these persons may, particularly where they possess a British Overseas Territory citizen Cayman Islands passport, erroneously believe they are Caymanian. In many instances, their unfortunate error in belief is usually realized only at some point later in their life when they need to prove that they possess the right to be Caymanian for employment purposes or for other instances. Mr. Speaker, we can all identify persons in our community who are unfortunately impacted by existing provisions in immigration law that restrict their qualification to be granted the right to be Caymanian. As a matter of fact, in some cases, persons may not have been aware that they lost the right to be Caymanian upon reaching the age of 18, or were unaware that to seek its continuation, they needed to act before they reached the age of 24. Consequently, they have continued to reside here, in some cases for many years, unaware of the actual reality of their legal status, immigration status under the existing law. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, Clause 5 seeks to amend Section 22, subsection 9 of the immigration law to provide that a person may at any age apply for Caymanian status when his or her status as a Caymanian may have expired when they reach the age of 18. Further, Clause 6 seeks to amend Section 23 of the law to remove the date restriction on eligibility for persons to apply for the right to be Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, this provision in the bill will remove an obstacle that prevents persons who are older than 24 seeking continuation of the right to be Caymanian where they have lost that right at 18. And secondly, reintroduces the ability for a person born in the Cayman Islands between 1977 and 1983 who is a British Overseas Territory citizen by birth and who has resided here since birth to apply for the grant of the right to be Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, both of these changes are partial solutions to the issue of ghost Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, another aspect of the bill deals with migrants who wish to appeal the Chief Immigration Officer's decision as it relates to asylum applications. Currently, the appellant would have to go do this through the Immigration Appeals Tribunal, which not only deals with asylum matters, but all immigration appeals. As a result of the number of appeal applications received, this inevitably leads to delays in the process. Mr. Speaker, with the establishment of a separate appellate body whose sole responsibility will be the consideration of appeals concerning asylum, we will enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the appeal process, thereby ensuring that delays to the repatriation process are kept to a minimum. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 provides for the creation of rules for the appeals from the Refugee Protection Appeal Tribunal. Furthermore, Clauses 13 and 14 provide for amendments to Section 84 of the law, allowing for the establishment and operation of the Refugee Protection Appeals Tribunal. As an appellate body dedicated only to hearing asylum appeals, the tribunal will be able to meet at short notice, ensuring that asylum applications and any related appeals are processed with optimum efficiency. In addition, Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that the members of the Refugee Protection Appeals Tribunal will receive training specifically relating to the procedures and criteria for determining refugee status applications and appeals. The United Nations High Commissioner has offered to assist in the delivery of such training, not only for the members of the tribunal, but also for staff involved in interviewing and assessing asylum applicants. It is also noteworthy to mention, Mr. Speaker, that the Cayman Islands has been commended by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for taking steps to establish this tribunal, which the UNHRC views as a good example of best practice in the region, in line with the Brazil Declaration and Plan of Action. Mr. Speaker and honorable members will remember that in May 2014, a private member's motion brought by the now member for Savannah brought to light concerns that the spouse of a permanent resident may be able to acquire British Overseas Territories citizenship more quickly than the spouse of a Caymanian. The requirement to be free from immigration restrictions before being able to apply for naturalization, which also applies to both the spouse of a Caymanian and the spouse of a permanent resident holder, essentially requires the person to have been granted permanent residence or the right to be Caymanian under domestic legislation. This is potentially where the spouse of a permanent resident may have been seen to be treated more favorably under the immigration law than the spouse of a Caymanian. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, Clause 9 of the bill will amend Section 31 of the immigration law and provides that a spouse of a Caymanian may, in certain circumstances, hold a residence and employment right certificate for an indefinite period of time. Once free from immigration restrictions, the spouse of a Caymanian would then be able to apply at the same time as the spouse of a permanent resident for the right to be Caymanian, thereby creating more equitable and fair grounds with respect to applications for the grant of British Overseas Territories citizenship. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, this provision ensures that the spouse of a Caymanian is treated no less favorably than the spouse of a permanent resident with respect to eligibility to apply for naturalization as a British Overseas Territories citizen. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, Clause 10 amends Section 32 of the immigration law to clarify that an applicant for the grant of permanent residency who was a dependent is not subject to the point system, albeit is subject to the requirements and obligation set out in Sections 30 subsection 6 to 23, as well as those referenced in Sections 33 and 38. Clause 11 amends Section 33 of the law to clarify the factors to be taken into account when determining whether to revoke or grant the continuation of a residence and employment rights certificate where the matter relates to persons who are or were a spouse of a Caymanian and who are also a parent of a Caymanian child. Mr. Speaker, Clause 8 also amends Section 30, subsection 7 of the immigration law to provide that a person who applies for the grant of permanent residence under Section 32 is required to pay certain fees in order for the application to be considered. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the ability for the child of a residency and employment rights certificate holder to apply for permanent residence upon reaching the age of 18 is being adjusted to make it clear that the application is not subject to determination by reference to the permanent residence points system. However, there are other requirements applicants would have to comply with in the existing legislation. And the point of that, Mr. Speaker, is that a child at 18 is unlikely to have either the financial means or the level of community involvement to gain any material points. And therefore, to apply or to expect that those requirements to apply to such an applicant is to be unrealistic and to virtually ensure that they would never, ever qualify. Mr. Speaker, the government has also turned its attention to the provisions in the immigration law that allow for the grant of a certificate of specialist caregiver. Under existing provisions of the immigration law, to be eligible for continued employment under a certificate of specialist caregiver, the worker must have been employed in one of the specified capacities by the same employer for at least 3 years immediately preceding the end of their term limit. This requirement reflects the intention that there had to be an established attachment between the person being cared for and the caregiver. However, Mr. Speaker, there is currently no discretion to deviate from the 3-year employment requirement, notwithstanding that there are genuine instances where caregivers have established close bonds with those whom they care for in less than 3 years, thereby enhancing quality of life for those vulnerable persons and providing greater peace of mind for their family members. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, in such genuine cases, the rigidity of the legislation leaves persons with no other option than to seek an exemption from the Cabinet with respect to work permit requirements. Needless to say, with the increasing number of these genuine requests received by Cabinet, it has been determined that it would be best for the Work Permit Board, the Chief Immigration Officer, and the Cayman Brac and Little Cayman Immigration Board to consider such applications. As a result, Clause 12 amends Section 37C of the law to allow for an application to be considered in exceptional circumstances where the worker has only been employed by the applicant for 1 year before reaching the end of their term limit. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Clause 17 contains transitional provisions related to the legislative changes. Mr. Speaker and honorable members, in conclusion, the bill will enable the government to enhance existing immigration facilities and streamline processes that are directly related to Caymanians and their dependents. Mr. Speaker, I wish to commend and thank all parties involved in helping us to bring this bill, which will help to further realize the government's priority of achieving sustainable social and economic development. Mr. Speaker, I expect that over the course of the next year, there will be further amendments to the immigration law as we work through the many issues and seek to develop the necessary measures to effect appropriate changes. But for the interim, I recommend the current bill, the Immigration Amendment Bill 2018, for the favorable consideration of this Honorable House. I thank you for the opportunity to present the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Does any other member wish to speak? The member from Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give a brief contribution to the Immigration Amendment Bill 2018. And I'll start by first saying that there are some positive changes as outlined by the Honorable Premier that I am pleased to see have been actually put into this bill. But I'll start my contribution by looking at the First Amendment. It caught my eye. Section 3 of the bill. And while I understand the rationale given by the Honorable Premier for why we're sort of duplicating the authority of the Chief Immigration Officer, with the exception of parts 6, 7, 8, and sections 103 and 101 of part of the subsequent part, I do have some concern that there was not enough done in these changes to deal with an issue that I think could become a problem, and I hope that the Honorable Premier will take this as constructive criticism. Because I think what we're creating here is a situation where we have two individuals in two separate departments who have, for the most part, duplicated authority. And by giving the Workforce Opportunities and Residency Cayman Department head the same powers of the Chief Immigration Officer, there's a potential that this could encourage, for want of a better word, cherry picking, in the sense that individuals who feel they can get further with one individual, one of the heads, may try to override or bypass the other. And I really don't see anything in the bill that provides a system of checks and balances to ensure that that sort of thing doesn't happen. It could, Mr. Speaker, happen not only with clients of the Immigration Department, but also with employees. In the sense, by having legislative powers shared, or powers given by the legislation shared between two individuals, I do see this sort of Twin Peaks scenario arising, where you have two heads and one can effectively override the other. And I don't see much of a way of a safeguard in this bill that would prevent that. So that was one thing that I think can lead to confusion and loss of efficiency in terms of the processing of the work that both of these entities are expected to process. I do understand it's an interim measure as the transition occurs, and overall I do support the need for this transition. However, I do have concerns about some of the transition as well. Also, Mr. Speaker, I have to turn my mind to how this will impact the deputies of the Chief Immigration Officer. Again, having someone with legislated powers equivalent to their boss, will this encourage them to perhaps bypass their legitimate head of their chain of command and go across to the other side? I'm not saying that, it will happen. I'm just saying that there's a potential for it. And I'm trying to be helpful. I thought I would point that out as part of my contribution to this debate. I think that everyone here, though, Mr. Speaker, will agree with me that, and the Premier just alluded to changes that are still to come with regard to the immigration law. And I think we've seen, Mr. Speaker, examples in the past of where we have made amendments and changes to this legislation over time. And I'm not blaming this government for any of that. This government has made changes, but previous government administrations have made changes. And over time, I think this legislation has become a bit convoluted in some parts and confusing. And we've seen examples of that with employees of the Immigration Department itself, where as we change and amend and change and amend, it becomes harder to follow and to to determine in some cases exactly what the law is saying. So perhaps, as a suggestion, Mr. Speaker, when we're looking at making further changes, the time has come for us to have a new piece of legislation, freshly drafted, which would seek to deal with some of the confusions and issues. Because I've spoken to individuals who have to work under this law, and it does exist. I won't say that it's a wholesale issue, but it does exist, and there's, whenever that sort of thing happens, Mr. Speaker, there is scope for mistakes to be made. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to see that the government has chosen to act quickly and deal with the issue identified with relation to what the so-called ghost Caymanians. I know that many individuals, and we saw what happened, Mr. Speaker, with the social media attention that it received, many individuals were very concerned, and not so much so based on factual information, but some misinformation that had gone around on social media. So I'm pleased to see that this is being addressed in this bill, and I'm happy to say that I wholeheartedly support making those changes.
Social media, you got it,
Yeah, I think most of the issue on social media started with a Facebook post, which was taken down and corrected, but it did disturb a number of people, a large number of people. And I think all of us, Mr. Speaker, had to spend some time trying to explain that a lot of the information being passed around was not correct. However, the issue is now being addressed. I'm also happy, Mr. Speaker, to see that the issue raised with my colleague from Savannah some years ago is being addressed as well. It's a bit disheartening that this issue has existed in our law for a number of years. And it is something that the member raised in an effort to get it corrected last term, and I'm happy to see that it's now moving forward, although I think it's a little bit late. However, better late than never. Mr. Speaker, Clause 7, 1A of the bill, which deals with who has the right to reside permanently, who that right can be granted to. I notice that we're making a change here, and hopefully when the Honorable Premier responds, he can explain the rationale behind this. But to me, it appears that the new wording actually includes, in making a decision to grant the right to reside permanently in the islands to an applicant, persons including their spouses who have been legally and ordinarily resident in the islands for a minimum period of 8 years. It seems as if those individuals, in being granted the right to reside permanently, we're also including their spouse automatically, or could be including their spouse automatically, without the spouse being subject to the intense vetting that I think all applicants for permanent residences should be. Maybe I am misinterpreting that clause, but it did trouble me when I saw that. Because it would seem as if the way it is being applied, Mr. Speaker, we would be giving the authority to grant permanent residence to the spouse of an applicant for permanent residence. And the way I read it, it seems as if there was be no consideration for how long that spouse has been resident in the islands. it would all be based on the length of tenure for the applicant. Maybe I am misinterpreting that, and hopefully someone will correct me if I'm wrong or clarify exactly what that clause is intending to do. Because if that were the case, Mr. Speaker, it would be, in my mind, lowering the level of scrutiny that we place on individuals who we give the privilege of coming here and becoming permanent residents. I know, Mr. Speaker, we're not in the business of breaking up marriages or running married couples away, but I would hope that there was going to be some vetting of these individuals, aside from the fact that they've been married to a Caymanian, or married to the applicant, sorry, and having lived here. I did, Mr. Speaker, in reading that, wonder if it was intentional, if it's one of these rumors we've been hearing circulating about the need to increase our population. But hopefully I have misinterpreted that. Sorry? Again, in clause 10, Mr. Speaker, we are removing the words "at the discretion of the board." And I think the Premier has given an explanation for that. However, that one did jump out at me as well. But I think he's already addressed that point, so I won't belabor that one. But overall, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to see that we're addressing a lot of the concerns that have been hanging around for quite some time in terms of rights of foreign spouse of a Caymanian. And I'm also pleased to see that we are now moving forward with restructuring the immigration function and the labor function. But I do also question, Mr. Speaker, what the rationale is behind moving the permanent resident and status functions to the new labor entity that's being created. In my mind, Mr. Speaker, that should remain an immigration function. I hear the Premier. I know he will correct me when he gets up, however. But if we look at, Mr. Speaker, if we look at the wording of 34A, it talks about the workforce opportunities in residency Cayman Department. But I thought the intention was, Mr. Speaker, to create an entity that was focused more on workforce, not to combine. It's almost like we're taking it from one place and putting it somewhere else, and there may be some restructuring going on, but I just don't see the rationale. And as I said, I'm sure that it will be explained when the Honorable Premier gets up to address or to reply. But in my mind, it would make more sense, Mr. Speaker, to have those individuals who have access to the information that is part and parcel of making decisions on PR and status, have them making those decisions, and have the labor people dealing with labor issues, work permits. It just seems more common sense to me. I don't know. Of course, I'm not privileged to be part of all the discussions and back and forth and how these decisions are being made. But again, I just thought I would raise it, point it out, and if the Honorable Premier wants to respond when he gets up, he will. Mr. Speaker, I'm also in support of the work that's being done, the changes that are being made with regard to asylum seekers and dealing with cases, because this, what I see here, is going to speed up the process and add a degree of efficiency. And we know the issues that have been hanging around in terms of dealing with, especially the Cubans that come here, the overcrowding in the detention centers, the at times less than perfect conditions that they have to live in, the costs of housing them, Mr. Speaker. So I'm happy to see that we're now making some progress in addressing those concerns, in creating an entity that is going to primarily deal with their issues and their cases. I have looked through the proposed amendments, and I really don't see anything that I could disagree with in this area. And I must commend the government for getting this put through. I know it will take some time to get everything in place. However, it is an important step forward. I don't recall, Mr. Speaker, the amount of money that's being spent housing individuals who are waiting to be processed, but I know it's significant. And from time to time, it tends to increase rather than decrease. So, Mr. Speaker, overall, I will support the bill. However, I thought I would add those few comments, criticism, but constructive. And I also think I offered some congratulations to the government for dealing with some of these issues that have been hanging around and have upset a number of Caymanians for years, and we've gotten them dealt with now in this bill. So with that short contribution, Mr. Speaker, I will say that I will be supporting the bill. However, I would like to hear some response to my queries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer my support to this bill, and especially two specific areas that I've been begging and pleading for. I'll actually go back to the motion tabled in the office of the clerk on the 15th day of May 2014. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier promised that they will bring the changes, and I'm glad to see he has joined the leadership of another leader to the north of us by keeping his promise. Mr. Speaker, it's heartening that it's finally made it, and I know between him and the Deputy Governor indicated that they would be bringing in, and it would be a certain amount of complications before they could arrive at it, but it's here. Mr. Speaker, the other one is the amendment in the Clause 12, which both you and I, Mr. Speaker, and at the time, Mr. Tibbetts, who was a minister and you were a minister at that time, talked about in regards to the specialist caregivers. I even remember you drawing a reference where one of your recipients of a caretaker's help actually took the patient to Jamaica with her because they didn't want to be separated. And I'm glad to see that you've taken away the qualification of the 3 years and brought it down to 1 year. Mr. Speaker, it just shows that it still gives us hope here that we have that humanitarian twist in us, deep-seated, to try to help those that are less fortunate. And I think that this legislation, amending legislation, will indicate that there is still hope for many of our seniors and other people that have been waiting so long on some of these amendments, and also the restructuring of the immigration in certain areas. and I offer my support to this legislation.
Member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Prospect.
Thank you. If I could have the lectern, please. I see that. Mr. Speaker, thank you for this opportunity to lend support to the Honorable Minister for Human Resources, Immigration, and Community Affairs to lay on the table of this Honorable House the Immigration Amendment Bill 2018. Move it. Thank you for that correction. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, please allow me this brief opportunity to also welcome and address the constituents of Prospect who are listening in to this afternoon's proceedings, of whom I have the pleasure of representing as their MLA, and also to whom I am afforded this opportunity in my contribution this afternoon to once again show proof that over the past year I have been steadfastly working to keep my word to them. In this instance, Mr. Speaker, that word that was given during the election campaign that I would work steadfastly and diligently towards finding solutions necessary to ensure equal opportunity for Caymanians, employment for Caymanians, and empowerment of Caymanians. These three words taken directly from my manifesto, and these three commitments being honored here today by the proposed amendments. Mr. Speaker, in his introduction, the Honourable Minister took the time to lay out what government is doing by way of the immigration amendments that seeks to follow through on this coalition government of national unity's commitment to enhancing existing immigration facilities and streamlining processes which are directly linked to Caymanians and their dependents. I would like, Mr. Speaker, to utilize some of my time speaking to why these proposed amendments are necessary and how they work towards building an effective Caymanian workforce. And perhaps understanding the why may also assist the questions that have been put before us by the member from Newlands in his questions. Therefore, let me begin, Mr. Speaker, with why we must ask ourselves, are these legislative changes needed? To answer that, we need only turn our attention to the statistics so ably provided by the ESO, or the Economic and Statistics Office. The Cayman Islands labor force reached 42,941 persons at the end of September 2017, representing an increase of 1.8%, or 745 persons over the same period in 2016. Of the total labor force, 40,856 persons, or 95.1%, were employed, while 2,085 persons, or 4.9%, were unemployed. This represented a small increase of 0.6% over the same period in 2016, when overall unemployment stood at 4.1%. As of January, likewise, 1st, 2017, the Department of Planning approved 1,013 projects with an estimated value of $688 million, which represents a sharp increase of some 33% on the same period in 2016, where there were some 760 projects approved, valued at $342 million. Since that time, we have seen additional new projects announced, including 2 new hotels, plus a third that was announced just this morning by the Honorable Minister of Tourism, 3 hotels from Pageant Beach to Beach Bay, at least 1 new high-end condominium development, and plans for the development of a potential conference center as part of the Georgetown revitalization plans, which will take that overall estimated value of projects on the books to well over $900 million in the next 2 years. So what do these numbers tell us, Mr. Speaker? They tell us that Cayman has a growing economy, and by all indications, that growth is expected to continue well into 2019 and beyond. But these developments, Mr. Speaker, will require capable human capital to achieve success. And that means more jobs that are on the horizon for Caymanians who are ready and willing to seize those opportunities. But why else, Mr. Speaker, do we need these amendments? Mr. Speaker, it cannot be overstated that the supply of labor is a key and oftentimes challenging component in the pursuit of economic stability, progress, and prosperity for this country. Yet, despite this recognition that labor is key, the last major structural improvements to the immigration regime, particular to the granting of work permits, are over 2 decades old, if not more, and were designed for a time when work permits were relatively low and unemployment, particularly amongst Caymanians, was non-existent. Today, however, we experience a Cayman that is witnessing a record number of work permits, and despite the fact that almost 96% of our population are employed, there still remains resentment that Caymanians are being left behind in this otherwise economic success story. In today's world, Mr. Speaker, the current immigration regime is no longer fit for purpose or sufficient to meet the needs of our growing and ever-expanding economy. That, Mr. Speaker, leads us to what is the government doing about this? In August 2017 at the SPS, or Strategic Policy Statement, and again in November 2017 during the budget debates, this national unity government announced plans for the development of a brand new agency that would be responsible for not only ensuring that we continue to sustain our labor market expansion, but one that would also leverage the dynamic mix of strategic incentives, workforce management solutions, and enforcement that would create opportunities for our Caymanians to more ably compete and advance within our world-class workforce. Mr. Speaker, back in August and November last year, we only had a concept. Today, in June 2018, not only do we have a concept, we have a roadmap, and we also have a name. And of course, that name was referred to by the minister. That name is WORC, W-O-R-C, which stands for Workforce Opportunity and Residency Cayman. In the last 6 months since the budget address, much has been accomplished towards the establishment of this new agency, including, Mr. Speaker, the appointment of an interim director to lead in the change management plans, whilst the job hunt is presently underway to source 3 additional persons who will serve as deputy directors to work. Today, Mr. Speaker, it is necessary to add resolve to our vision of transformation to workforce development and immigration matters by extending the powers required to facilitate that interim director and her growing team in delivering the functions and responsibilities of the post. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, as the Premier laid out, The part of the amendments proposed here
Mr.
today.
Speaker?
The member from Newlands, do you have a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. In accordance with Standing Order 34A, I'd like to draw your attention to Standing Order 32-4.
34B.
Is it B?
B,
Sorry, 1 second, Mr. Speaker. I may have misquoted it.
to elucidate some matter raised by the member in the course of his speech
No, 34A.
by rising to a point of when the member speaking shall resume his seat and the member interrupting shall direct attention to the point which he wishes to submit to the presiding officer for decision. Your point, sir?
I'd like to draw your attention to 32-4 of the Standing Orders, Mr. Speaker.
32-4. A member shall not read his speech but may refresh his memory by references to notes and may read extracts of reasonable length from books or papers in support of his argument. Which one of these points you taken in this part?
Mr. Speaker, I believe the member's reading his speech.
Now, honorable member, I quite understand the feelings of some members today and otherwise, but I'm not going to call that matter a point of order. And just to say that I've been watching the member as I do watch other members, and that member has looked at me quite often while speaking, which means he's using copious notes for his speech, and therefore not reading an entire speech as such. But I must add that given this particular subject, if a member was reading his speech, I would perhaps not see him, because this is such an important matter and such points that we have to give and take, and sometimes we may not see such matters. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. To continue, therefore, Mr. Speaker, as was laid out by the Premier, the amendments proposed here today in the Immigration Amendment Bill, which are specifically contained in Clause 3 of the bill, seek to effectively transfer the powers of the acting chief immigration officer to the interim director of work. And before I attempt to answer the question from the member from Newlands, let me state, Mr. Speaker, that specifically what the proposals before this Honourable House seek to accomplish is to extend the powers, duties, functions, privileges, and immunities with respect to migration, application, and authority to the interim director. These powers will relate specifically to the granting of work permits, permanent residency, and Caymanian status. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we are not proposing that two people share the same powers. But what we are in fact proposing, Mr. Speaker, is that the powers for migrant application and authority be transferred from the acting chief immigration officer and given to the interim director of the Workforce Opportunity and Residency Cayman, or work. So no, there won't be a battle with regards to one person believing they might have a better relationship with this individual over that individual. What this bill is proposing is that the acting chief immigration officer will retain his powers, duties, functions, privileges, and immunities as contained in Part 6, 7, and 8, as well as Section 103 and 111 of the immigration law, which, for the benefit of those in the public domain, deal with matters such as visa applications, landing and entry, visitor extensions, and asylum seekers. These changes, Mr. Speaker, will enable the Chief Immigration Officer to better focus his time and apply his expertise in relation to the second change management exercise that is ongoing simultaneous to the development of work, and that being the merger of certain aspects of the Customs Department and Immigration Department, which will lend itself also to the creation of a new integrated Border Protection Agency, which, of course, I believe we will learn a bit more about when this Honorable House engages in the Advanced Passenger Information Bill 2018. If I may also seek to elucidate the member from Newlands and his question as it relates to Section 7 of the Immigration Amendment Bill 2018, and I will ask for the House indulgence because in order to explain the member's question, I will be required to read from the law, both the Immigration Amendment Bill and the existing Immigration Law 2015 revision. But to summarize, whilst Section 7 does seek to repeal Section 29 and subsections 1 and 2, it is not going to be a free-for-all, but instead Section 7 is still bound by the provisions outlined in Section 32(1) of the Immigration Law 2015 revision, which reads, "The dependent of a residency and employment rights certificate holder having attained the age of 18 years may apply to the board or the chief immigration officer for a residency employment rights certificate and shall, at the discretion of the board or the chief immigration officer, be granted the right to permanently reside in the islands under Section 31 if A, he is declared in the original application for the certificate, B, he is found to be of good character and conduct, C, he has been legally and ordinarily resident in the islands for at least 7 years immediately prior to the application, and D, the holder of the residency and employment rights certificate continues to possess it and has become a Caymanian. Therefore, again, it won't be a free-for-all. It will still be bound by statutes in law, and certainly to the member's question, it will not simply allow us to extend rights without going through the natural process. Mr. Speaker, this bill is the beginning of the legislative changes that are necessary to establish and empower the work agency to deliver a fit-for-purpose workforce system for these Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, it is my full expectation that during the fall sitting of this Honorable House, we will see additional bills which will fundamentally improve the job placement and work permit systems in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, upcoming legislation is also expected to include provisions to establish a Fair Employment Commission. This commission, Mr. Speaker, will provide additional avenues for Caymanians who feel that they have been discriminated against in the workforce to have an avenue to seek remedies. Now, Mr. Speaker, these plans that we have been speaking of have not been developed in secret, but quite to the contrary. Over the last 6 to 12 months, whether they be appearances in the media, whether they be continued discussions with stakeholders, the Chamber of Commerce, and others, these plans have all been disclosed openly. Now, the most common question that we get from those stakeholder meetings is, why are we seeking to move work permits, permanent residence, and Cayman status under the umbrella of work? With your permission, I will now attempt, Mr. Speaker, to answer the why part of that question. But, Mr. Speaker, the answer is quite simple. Work permits, PR, and Caymanian status are major contributing factors to the overall labor force. For every work permit that is issued and approved, that means that is one less job that a Caymanian can otherwise occupy. And when a work permit is being granted, two things need to be accomplished. One, we have to determine first and foremost that there isn't an available and willing Caymanian there to take that job. And two, we must recognize that in business, time is money. Therefore, the process of granting work permits must be efficient and mindful of the needs of the businesses who in fact are the ones who are creating these new jobs, and is therefore essential that we as a government recognize and support this fact. By creating a fair, efficient, and transparent work permit regime, Mr. Speaker, work will be able to identify jobs presently going to work permit holders that Caymanians can occupy, without sacrificing the needs of that business to have capable and experienced workers who will in turn enable companies to remain competitive and profitable. Mr. Speaker, what this means is that there will be greater opportunities for the 800 plus students who graduate every year from our high schools, and enable them the opportunity to find a foothold into what may very well become their life's work. This also means, Mr. Speaker, that our education curriculum can be tailored based on tangible evidence to ensure greater compatibility to soft skills that are needed by employers to ensure that once our young graduates exit high school, those that don't go on to tertiary education can in fact again secure entry-level jobs, something that is not happening today with any degree of regularity. Mr. Speaker, work will also be responsible for monitoring changes within our dynamic labor market that will provide government with the strategic oversight, planning that is needed in order to prepare for the future human resource requirements that will build capacity and capability amongst Caymanians to more ably compete. Now, what this means, Mr. Speaker, is that those students who are returning university graduates will now have better opportunity to put into practice the knowledge they have otherwise learned in theory, to be able to do so in practice, and again, find more jobs. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned two aspects that are important in the present day. The first is the record number of work permits and the need to get Caymanians into these jobs. And secondly is the growing resentment that Caymanians feel left behind in the otherwise successful and growing economy. Mr. Speaker, it may startle you, and I think many listening in, certainly when I have these conversations in the public domain, most people don't realize it. But it may startle you, Mr. Speaker, to recognize that there are three specific categories of work permit holders that represent some 15,000 persons, or 70% of the overall work permit numbers that are granted to foreign workers that I believe, that we believe, Caymanians can occupy. These three categories: service and sales workers, which includes barbers, bartenders, waiters, waitresses, cashiers, cooks, hairdressers, security guards, kind of like the ones that work at the government administration building. Elementary occupations, which include domestic helpers, caregivers, kitchen and laundry attendants, beach attendants, general laborers, and cleaners. And the third category, craft and trade workers, which include auto mechanics, auto body repairmen, electricians, carpenters, plumbers, masons. These are all jobs that Caymanians can do. And it's for this reason, Mr. Speaker, that work is being designed with talent management in mind. Work will seek to identify the gaps which are keeping Caymanians from these jobs today, which we accept, I think, are largely vocational jobs, by implementing effective programs that are tailored to reflect the jobs that are in demand today, that make up our labor market today, by equipping Caymanians with the necessary skills in order to occupy those jobs today. In so doing, Mr. Speaker, I believe we will see a decrease in the demand for work permits in these three categories, which again make up 70% of the overall work permit numbers that we oftentimes complain about or hear complained about in the media. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, to address the feelings of Caymanians being left behind, work will develop additional workforce development plans, programs, such as internships and apprenticeships that will enable Caymanians better access to climb the corporate ladder. That means the Caymanian professionals who otherwise argue that they've reached the glass ceiling and can't go any further. It's a real situation, and one that I believe we can actively overcome, and with the plans laid out and the proposed amendments put forward today, we can in fact overcome that glass ceiling and give our Caymanians the opportunities they so richly deserve. Supporting this will be the Fair Employment Opportunities Commission, which I mentioned earlier on, and which was recently announced by the Premier, that will seek to ensure that Caymanians, once they possess the requisite academic and vocational skills, perhaps even combined with the requisite experience, are in turn to be given the opportunities they so richly deserve without disadvantaging the businesses that employ them. Again, this is a legislative initiative that will come before this Honorable House again in the fall, and I hope it will also be greeted with support from the members. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, the establishment of work represents a paradigm shift in the way we do business in the Cayman Islands and the way we both plan for the present job needs as well as lay a foundation for the future job needs for the next 25 to 50 years. The amendments being proposed here today, I'm grateful to hear from both the member from Newlands and the honorable member from Savannah, can be supported, and they're glad to see these amendments finally coming to the Legislative Assembly. I believe the amendments being proposed here today represent an important pivot point towards achieving strategic goal number 2 in the National Unity Government's overall 8 strategic objectives, and that is to improve the functioning of the labor market and to ensure that all Caymanians who need employment find employment. Because after all, that is the reason we are here. That is the purpose we have been elected, and that is the objective that this unity government has set itself on. As such, Mr. Speaker, I will ask that all members give their support to this initiative, which is something we all campaigned on. And by voting yea when the time comes in favor of the immigration amendments, you too may have the opportunity to be seen as keeping your word to the people who elected you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? the member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while I wait for the podium to come, I'm not sure if it may be a good timing for the Honorable Speaker to the Honorable Premier to take the point of order in time, because I see we are 3 minutes away from that time where we're supposed to be. Okay, I was just trying to assist. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my contributions to the amendments proposed by the Honorable Premier in respect to the immigration law. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be as congratulatory as some other members, because the elected member from Prospect had every right to use the word finally these amendments are being brought to the House. The Premier also highlighted the fact that for many terms now, members of the opposition have been begging the government to make these amendments. And just for clarity, Mr. Speaker, the man who holds the post as leader of this country is in his second term. So, Mr. Speaker, there's no excuse why this hasn't been addressed already. Mr. Speaker, I think if there is any congratulatory that needs to be done, it needs to be done to the members of the opposition. And I dare say, in particular, the elected member from East End, who has constantly put the pressure on this administration and the last administration to make these changes. Mr. Speaker, I do not think that the government quite understands the effect of the delay of making these changes on the lives of those people who are affected by it. The fact that people could not work because of these failures within the immigration law, people who have been here for so long cannot provide for their children, can't find work, while we have the elected member from East End who's been speaking about it for at least 8 years. Pardon me, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that today shows an example for those out there who say that members of the opposition cannot get anything done. But, Mr. Speaker, I dare say that I found out the strategy today. Repeat, 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 embarrass, repeat. And, Mr. Speaker, though that there are, let me take a look at the bill again. I think there's 5 particular amendments that this bill seeks to bring. The one in respect to those that deal with persons that are being considered as ghost Caymanians should have been dealt with a long time ago. So if anybody else wants to give congratulations onto the rest of the things, I dare say it's quite like a baby father who wants congratulations for paying his child support. You don't get congratulations for things you're supposed to do. Mr. Speaker, I see that you've given much leniency to the scope of this debate, as the elected member from Prospect has gone on to glorifying his administration as to what the work department is going to do. I thought we were speaking about the immigration amendments. Now I hope, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, the chair recognizes the importance of this immigration bill, and indeed how important immigration has been to our country and is today and will be for many years because we're a small population with a huge, huge economy. And therefore, this chair, I don't think that I have gone overboard in allowing members to traverse the ground that has been traversed because it relates, all of it is intertwined. So if you're careful, you will get the same treatment, but be careful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you had given me 7 more seconds, you would understand why I said so, because I expect the same leverage, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Be careful.
thank you for the advice, Mr. Speaker.
We have reached, Honorable Member, we have reached the hour of 4:30. Honorable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2, that the business of the House may continue past the hour 4:30.
The question is that Standing Order 10-2 be suspended in order for the House to continue after 4:30. And members are reminded that a message was sent out that we will continue at least till 10 o'clock if the House is so minded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Continuing with my contribution to the bill that has been brought to this honorable House, some things are concerning me, Mr. Speaker, in respect to lack of information that has been provided by the Honorable Premier and the Minister in charge of immigration. Some things that I was hoping to hear from the Honorable Premier, because I do support the motion. I want to make sure that I'm clear, the bill, I want to make sure that I'm clear in respect to that, and I intend to vote for it. But some of the things that I expected to hear within this bill so that the Caymanian people who are listening can be informed about all matters relating to this would have been situations like, how many people do we expect to be applying once we make this change? And whatever that number is, how is it going to affect the country as a whole? How is it going to affect our schools? How is it going to affect our social welfare system? Do we have enough money? Are we making adjustments for those projections? Are they in the thousands? Are they in the hundreds? Are they in the tens? Mr. Speaker, I expected the Premier to come prepared with that type of information to inform the people of this country. We know it's a serious problem and there's a large number, but yet today we do not have the data to even say it's 150, 5,000, or anything. I think the government is ill-prepared to even address this problem. Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the government, and I hope that in response, because I expected a very exciting response, Mr. Speaker, that the government can say to the people of this country that they have staffed the work agency well enough to deal with these applications very quickly. Because, Mr. Speaker, I say that there's so many persons in this position, though we do not have an exact figure, I suspect it's well into the hundreds, and that are connected and providers of other Caymanians who have their rights already, that are being affected financially, and that the government has to accept that this has to be addressed quickly. It's been delayed for too many years. So I'm hoping that they're giving them the necessary staff to do so. And Mr. Speaker, I'll also add to that that there is a second pending problem that is hurting what we consider as ghost Caymanians. Because not only do they not have any rights to say that they're Caymanian, But at least just up until recently, if they had a Cayman passport or if they had a birth certificate, the employers in the country would say, well, I think you're Caymanian, I'm going to give you some work. So though they didn't have the rights in the country, they were able to sustain themselves through a flaw in the system. Now, the recent problem that we've had, where employers recognize the failures within the immigration system, they're clamping down themselves. So these people it is even more important that this government acts right away. Because since that has happened, which I suspect has just been over a year ago, none of those ghost Caymanians can provide for themselves at all anymore, unless they're doing it illegally. And I can dare say, Mr. Speaker, every one of us in here knows that if one of them happened to have children, funny things people do when they have to provide for them children if they can't do it legally. And I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that the government is considering those minute little issues. Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this bill has been taking too long to get here. But I want to take this opportunity to use that leverage that was offered to me, Mr. Speaker, in respect to the overall connection to immigration and labor and the effects of it. And I want to say thank you to the councillor, an elected member from Prospect, for giving such detailed information in respect to what they're doing. I genuinely believe he's a hard worker and he will continue to do so. But, Mr. Speaker, I still haven't heard these programs they're going to implement, how they're going to, after bringing these programs into play, how they're going to force the employers out there to hire the Caymanians, because they talk about these certificates. There are plenty of Caymanians in this country who come home qualified and still can't get work. They've yet to tell me how they're going to address that. Because the truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, and I pose this question to the elected member of Prospect just recently on a local radio station. And the question was quite simple. Who determines whether a Caymanian is qualified in this country? And Mr. Speaker, if there's one question I would like answered in response to my contribution to this bill being presented to this House, it would be that one. Who determines whether a Caymanian is qualified? And the only answer that I've gotten so far is the employer. And Mr. Speaker, the reason I asked that question, because if we are also acknowledging that there is malicious employers out there who are disenfranchising Caymanians from giving them the right opportunity, how can we trust the employers to be the ones to qualify whether a Caymanian is qualified to do a job? Just recently, Mr. Speaker, I had the honor to be a part of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And one of the discussions was education. And that educators and labor markets are now starting to put more emphasis on experience rather than certification. And that it should be focused on. And Mr. Speaker, that caught my eye or my ears so well, because that's exactly what we're having an issue with in the Cayman Islands. We are a growing nation, and there's still many strong, experienced Caymanians who can do many of these jobs, but because they can't come with one little piece of paper to say that I can do the job, and even when they come with the paper, they still can't get the job. So I'm still waiting with all this magic that the government speaks about in respect to what they're going to do with immigration and labor and mix them all up together. You know what the people are saying, Mr. Speaker? You're just transferring it from one department to the other. That's what they're saying, Mr. Speaker. Changing the name. They changed the name 3 administrations ago. What was it called? Under the honorable elected member from West Bay, Alston. Oh, he changed it. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, my point is that I don't think we're grasping the problem that is presented before us, which is the truth is many employers in this country do not want to give us the opportunity to succeed, and it's sometimes financially related. Yes, there are some Caymanians who do not give it their best, but they cannot be the ones that label everybody, and that cannot be the excuse that every employer in this country uses to say that Caymanians don't want to work. Mr. Speaker, I want to share an experience with you I had just recently. A young man comes back home with a bachelor's degree in science and applies to a very prominent investor in this country. Very prominent, I say not more. And then he received a letter to say, I'm sorry, but you are overqualified. And I am embarrassed. I called that organization and expressed my feelings, and I'll say no names today as I continue to deal with the problem, and hopefully they can fester up and apologize and fix that issue. But this is the reality that we're facing. So no matter how much magic that they're talking about in respect to switching this around, switching that around, if they do not intend for those employers out there who are acting in this way, there's, Mr. Speaker, my honorable opposition leader just whispered to say enforce the law, and though I would love to agree with him in respect to that, I want to know what law they're going to enforce. They cannot enforce the law on an employer when there's no law to stipulate what is a qualification for a certain job. Until you have a list that is agreed upon by either a committee of some sort, an authority, or the elected members of this house to say this is the criteria for this job and its law or regulations, you cannot hire that person because there's a Cayman who meets this criteria. Until that happens, you can't enforce anything. Because at the current moment, which I would dare say to some degree, rightfully so, an employer has every right to say, no, that's not what we want. Because they dictate exactly who is qualified for what. Unless they fall in certain certified positions in the country, like you have to have a law degree to be called to the bar to be a lawyer. You have to have electrician's license in order to act as an electrician, or a plumber's license. So anything that is licensed or certified under certain authorities, then you have precedent set to say you can't have the job without these things. But let's just say for argument's sake, Mr. Speaker, a gas pump attendant. Who decides who is qualified as a gas pump attendant? And can an employer say, no, I want them to speak Portuguese? And are we saying then we're leaving it up to the board that is selected by a political party that has influence to be the deciders? Is that what we're saying that is our policing mechanism to say the board won't do that? Because that's the excuse, Mr. Speaker, that I'm giving, is that the board can tell them no. But when one of the political friends call the board and say, listen, I want this work permit to go through, it's going through, Mr. Speaker. So how can you police that? Mr. Speaker, until this government takes a serious look or takes serious action in respect to making a stance on what a person is qualified to do and have a list or high criteria set out for the many 70% of jobs like the good member from Prospect suggested. You mean to tell me we cannot create a list of entry-level jobs to middle management to say this is what's considered to be a qualified, or this is what the criteria is that you have to meet as a Caymanian to be able to pump gas. And once you meet that criteria, they cannot deny your job at all and there won't be no work permits. That employer can simply say, and we can have it in regulations, we can have that list, and that list can be national so everybody can know what it is. So when a person applying to say, I've met the criteria, and there are going to be no questions about whether I get the job or not. because we're leaving it up to human beings, and God forbid, Mr. Speaker, I don't trust human beings anymore. So if we're going to leave it up to say the policing mechanism to make sure that the Cayman get a job is a board, well, I don't have any faith, because that board is appointed by somebody. And history has shown us that everybody has a conflict somewhere, that knows somebody who's a friend of some other friend. I thank God, Mr. Speaker, that I don't have too much of them. But I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to do the job of the people. Mr. Speaker, in respect to the other 4 items on this immigration bill, I've already said to this honorable House I intend to give my support to it. But I really hope that this government takes a more serious look in respect to their approach to work in this country. The economy is doing well. Planning approvals are up. Budget money and revenue is coming in. And we still have Caymanians who are unemployed. And one of the jurisdictions that is considered the best in the whole of the Caribbean, but yet still they can't even get a job. Speaking of scope of the debate, Mr. Speaker, this government won't even talk about the minimum wage that was supposed to be re-examined at year 2, and I can't even get an answer on that question, Mr. Speaker. So how can this government sit down and promote about how great things are on path and we're going down the right track? How long before this track ends while my people sit down and starve to death? While the cost of living continues to increase?
I didn't say you should sit down, but since you has, you know that's not an immigration bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I know that the honorable member from Prospect spoke about a couple of things that weren't in the bill, but that's okay, Mr. Speaker. I'll continue and move on, as I don't want to in any way disrespect this honorable chair, Mr. Speaker. I hope, I think I've touched enough, and I think that I've probably made enough controversy for the local media house to allude to editorials about me being divisive again. But let me, for those who are listening, my sole job in this parliament is to protect Caymanians. And when I say Caymanians, I don't care how you became Caymanian. Whatever our law says, that's my job. That's what I came here to do. By plane, by pen, by paper, by board, if you are a Caymanian, my job is to protect you. So, for those who are saying that we're divisive, maybe you should consider and look around exactly a little bit more in your community, because they seem to think that everything is all rosy. Maybe you should go down in the ghetto more often when children are sleeping in rat-infested homes. In my country, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, I quite understand your feelings, and you have room by motion if you want to discuss that general feeling of the situation you're speaking of. But I don't believe you can continue in that vein on the matter of the immigration bill unless you're tying what you're saying to the immigration bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that my skill set in respect to learning to tie my viewpoints back to the bill is slowly developing, and I will get on with it, and I will learn it as we go. So for now, until I get more of those skills, and I'll call you after Parliament is done so you can teach me some of those skills, if you are willing.
Be careful, you're not walking on glass bottle, okay?
I'm going to close now, Mr. Speaker, and say thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the presenting of this bill, but I want to also congratulate the elected member from East End for continuing to pressure publicly and in this parliament to force this administration to finally address the problem of the ghost Caymanian. So when it's time for us in our society to start throwing out the credit, before we are quick to jump to the conclusion that yes, this administration did it, nuh-uh. Think again. If Mr. McLean didn't do it time and time and time again, and by the support of the opposition leader and the likes of Mr. Anthony Eden talking about the morality of what we're not doing and the embarrassment of it, they probably wouldn't have dealt with it yet. So I want to congratulate them. In respect to the other four things on this bill, I want to congratulate the government for dealing with those things, and I will be giving my support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other, the member for Bordentown West?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't need that. I'm not going to no notes this time. I really wasn't planning on speaking on this bill, Mr. Speaker, but I want to use this opportunity to, and sorry, Mrs. Can you give a copy of this to the Speaker, please? There was an editorial on the May 29, 2018 of the Cayman Compass that says, keeping government out of Cayman's employment business. And this was in relation, sir.
Do you have enough copies to lay one on the table, or?
No, but I really don't plan to read it.
If you not plan to read?
No, that's what I was referring to, so I just gave it you a copy. That's a reference.
But if you are going to mention things from it, then perhaps we should lay it on the table. And you can continue, and I'll get my copies
Okay.
copied so we can lay it on the
No
table.
problem. Yeah, okay, well, thank you. I won't go into the details of the editorial, Mr. Speaker, but rather to say, it ends by saying that the government basically has no place in the employment business of this country. And I think we need to get that clarified. Section 59(2) of the Constitution, I believe, it states this legislative body may make laws for the peace, order, and good government of this country. The thing about it, Mr. Speaker, is that I recognize that immigration can be quite an emotional issue. This year, for my family, makes 80 years since my grandmother first arrived on these shores. And I look at the 10 kids that she raised, only one went to college. I look at her grandkids, I think there are around 16 of us, and I look at her great-grandkids, probably about over 30, that's going to be college educated. What has made our island successful, Mr. Speaker, and I know you and I have had this conversation along with other members, is not just immigration, but rather integration. And that, I believe, ultimately is a success, part of our success as a country, because we have been able to build on our diverse background to some extent. And we have got to recognize that there are people amongst us that will try to destroy that very fabric of what it is that has made this country what it is today. And when I see editorials such as these, that creates this us and them type mentality, I think it misses the point that regardless of where we came from, at the end of the day, I like the fact that I live in a country where at some point, a person in another country could have sat around a table, could have sat around a meeting, could have been sat under a tree, and basically said, you know, if I get a job in the Cayman Islands, my life would be better, my family life would be better. This is the country that we have. And the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, is that immigration will continue to be a challenge, not just for this government, future governments, as it is for many governments around the world. We see the case even in the United States. We see the case with Brexit. We see what is going on in Europe. I mean, the internet has basically showed us that this is an issue that is not just something for us alone to do. What it is that we need to be careful of is that, one, we need to make sure at all times we maintain an open mind, and at the same time we also be responsible. Now, at the same time, Mr. Speaker, I'm also mindful that regardless of the successes that we have had, there are some people that have been left behind. And we can all look at the numbers and say, you know what, a 7% unemployment rate for Caymanians is good. That is fine if you are one of the 93% that are working, but not when you're part of that 7%. And what we also need to be careful of, Mr. Speaker, is that we don't sit down and tout our successes and at the same time forget that there are other people that are also hurting. Now, I believe that this law, along with these changes, is a step in the right direction in terms of moving our country forward. And I suspect that for every government in the foreseeable future will always have amendments to make to this law. But what we need to make sure of, as we're making those amendments, that we be mindful of not just the Caymanians that we have today, but of the Caymanians that come tomorrow. And the reason why I take this position, Mr. Speaker, is that if it wasn't for the welcomeness that was given to my family 8 years ago, my grandmother, and also to my father probably about maybe 50 years ago, I don't think I probably would be standing here today. So I am glad to some extent to see that the government is addressing these issues. Yes, there are other issues to be addressed, and I believe that it is a little bit timely to some extent. For some, it may never come quick enough, but what I will ask the government to do is just to make sure that as they move forward in establishing this new agency, that they learn from the mistakes that we had both from the Immigration Department and from the NWDA, and at least put a little bit more teeth inside the law of enforcement. Because as much as we can pick on the unscrupulous and bad employers, there are still a lot of good employers in this country. Because at the end of the day, it is those employers that employed our people that allow this island to be what it is today. And we can't find ourselves in a position where we're just trying to penalize the good for the few bad ones that we have. So, with that said, Mr. Speaker, I just want to rise to lend my support to the changes and to the amendments to the immigration law that the government is bringing, but at the same time, just send the editorial board of the Cayman Compass the message that it is our business, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are here to represent the people. We're the ones who have been given that responsibility. And I will say this to anyone: if you don't like it, go put your $1,000 up and go walk door to door and beg your votes. Outside of that, we are the ones that the people are calling when there are problems. I'm sure every member inside this house get the text messages, they get the phone calls. And at the end of the day, we are the ones who have to answer them. I don't see anyone going to any newspaper looking for a job. As a matter of fact, if you go in there looking for a job, they're probably going to charge you for it, just to even print it. So we need to be careful that editorials such as these don't sit down and divide our country. We don't want people to create this us and them type mentality, because this is not what the country needs. This is not how we move this country forward. This is not what this country was built on. You know what I mean? And I don't want anyone to believe that while we may be a little bit emotional on these issues, that anyone inside there is anti-expat or anything. I can tell you many members from across the aisle, spouses, are from different countries. I can tell you firsthand, Mr. Speaker, my wife is from Jamaica. I married her at a time before we had the amendments that we have today for the employment rights certificate. And I can tell you, I know what it is like when someone looks at my wife who's married to me with my child and say, we're going to deport you and your baby because you overstayed. Okay? I know what that feeling is like. So, with that said, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the government for moving on this. And it's a step in the right direction. It's not perfect, but it's an improvement. And just learn from what mistakes we have made in the past, and all of us inside there going to do what we can do to make it better. I just have to get that off my chest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The member for East End, are you rising?
Yes, sir.
The member for East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where to begin, whether I should begin with the goodly gentleman from Georgetown Central and all his heaping of accolades on me for pressuring the government into doing this, or start with this compost newspaper. Mr. Speaker, let me begin by saying that I thank the members of this honorable House for holding my brother in reverence this morning by observing a minute of silence for him. And I thank those of my colleagues who called me and expressed condolences to myself and my family over the last week. The majority did. For whatever personal reasons the others didn't, I thank them for this morning too. I said recently that we are a tribe, we are a clan, but most of all, we are a family. So, my brother has departed this worldly sphere and gone to his reward in the great beyond. And I hope Sunday to let the people of this country know what he meant to my family. Mr. Speaker, the issue at hand, the subject at hand, is that of immigration amendment. Let me say that immigration has been the source of contention in this country ever since I can remember, and I suspect, like the Premier said earlier, it will continue to be so. I believe it is the one piece of legislation in this country that has been amended more than any other. And if we look at the law, 2015 revision, that will tell us exactly how many times it has been amended. Mr. Speaker, unlike other large countries, we have a unique situation on our hands that we have had for a very, very long time. We are the product of our own successes. And it will be our failure if we do not address it properly through the immigration law. Because we certainly cannot expect to multiply so many Caymanians in so short a time and educate them. We never did. To maintain the sophistication and the requirements of what we have built. And I say we, and at the same time recognizing those who came before me, who started this process, especially over the last 50 years. So, Mr. Speaker, when I see the likes of David Legge being given the opportunity and the right to rub shoulders with me and members of these honorable hallowed halls who can count back 10 generations and then tell us how to run our country. I merely say to him and all those who would tell us how we must do it, you see my glory, you don't know my story. You don't know the struggles that we have had. You don't know the challenges of trying to ensure our people survive in a world such as that which is currently visited upon us. Such as those who would call themselves mother are currently doing. And then we think of this man who comes from America and see how his president is proposing to build walls to the blue almighty sky to prevent people from coming there. Maybe we should have built one so he couldn't climb over too. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe not. Maybe we needed him to prompt us to be more resilient and not to forget the past, lest we destroy the future with people like him. Mr. Speaker, when he will go so far as to criticize the leader of this country in a paragraph of his so-called newspaper. I like to call it a tabloid about this work department. Mr. Speaker, he needs to know that in my case now, since the 18th of June, freedom means nothing left to lose. David Legge, I wish for you the same thing I wish for a couple governors. Smooth sailing with hurricane winds upon your back, and may you never see the shores.
Who did that?
Mr. Speaker, these are the type of people we don't need. And in time, during this sitting, I hope there are a number of others that I'm going to tell that to too. Especially those that I will tell it to are those who purport to be Caymanians and protect this country and at the same time destroying it. I know them all. That is the benefit of being in here longer than you get for murder. And from here on in, I'm going to use it to ensure the people that I represent, and Mr. Speaker, the people you represent, know who these people are. Mr. Speaker, I don't know who circulated that. You? Yeah, I did. You need to Death sentence too look like sound like. No, not death. But a sentence, anyhow. Mr. Speaker, that was in jest to my good friend. Mr. Speaker, I wish the staff of that newspaper well, but not the so-called owner. We got soon find out who beneficial ownership is in that too. That's going to be interesting. Very interesting. Mr. Speaker, let me now touch briefly on some of the amendments that this government
Yes.
is bringing. Mr. Speaker, yes, I have been advocating for these changes, particularly the ones with the ghosts, the Cayman, the people here who were Caymanians and then lost that opportunity. And according to Legge, they call ghost. I don't say anything ghost to them, they're flesh and blood. But we know how we, in what context we use that. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the amendments being proposed by the government. However, I did hear a member from Prospect on the radio a few days ago saying that, and I hope it was a mistake he was making, because he was saying that people could apply for it before 24. And whilst I did not have my law immediately available, I do know that was what was there, and the objective was to remove that. And by removing that, we now give all those who are, I think it was the last meeting, Mr. Speaker, the Premier brought a young lady who 40 years old or something in that region, granted by cabinet. And I said then, it will take us 100 years to correct the rest of them through cabinet, and we needed to get this thing done pronto. They are by and large all Caymanians. We grew up with them, our children grew up with them, and I know my good friend from Georgetown Central said he wondered what the social impact will be on the country. Well, I don't think that is going to be that significant, because they have been here all their lives. So I really don't, but granted, he has a right to question that. But I welcome the opportunity to say to those people that they must now go and regularize their status in this country. You have children whose future is bleak if they do not have a country of origin. And they need to do it, because those are the same children who will wine and dine and play and enjoy and work with our children. And with a different status than our children, regardless of who they are or who our children are, they're human beings, and they're going to look at them differently. And they should not be doing that. Mind you, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows my position on the way going forward about Cayman status. The country knows that. I need not repeat that. The section, in section 23, which was done by the UDP government, which gave provisions for them, those who were born here between 77 and 82 to apply with 77 and 82 to apply within 1 year of 21st December 2006. Having that removed also is a good thing on their behalf, but it's a much better thing for our own people, because I've had numerous representations from Caymanians who were born in that period that the government was requiring them, or businesses were requiring them to get recognized as Caymanians. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the 18th day of June, my son finished university in Oxford. He seems to be a professional student, but anyhow, soon he'll join the workforce. Mr. Speaker, I hope to my God Almighty no one in this country asks him to prove that he's Caymanian by virtue of getting a letter from the Immigration Board over his birth certificate and that of mine. I hope that never happens, because that's the day it's going to be challenged. Mr. Speaker, this is another area the government needs to address, and I addressed that at the last meeting. But in the immigration law, or whether the government wants to do it through policy, it needs to be addressed. The government has set a criteria policy for proving that you're Caymanian. There are two areas in this democracy that requires absolutely that you are Caymanian. One, to run to become a representative here. And two, to be a registered elector.
You don't want to be proven that you're Caymanian?
Those two are the ultimate positions. That is to participate in this vibrant democracy. The government has a requirement for it to prove you're Caymanian. Birth certificate. That's it. Now, this started with a couple of those law firms. By their HR, people coming in here, not knowing who people are, not understanding what this country's about, and requiring potential employees to prove that they're Caymanian. Well, the only way I can prove I'm Caymanian, Mr. Speaker, is by virtue of my birth certificate and that of one of my parents. Mr. Speaker, when you go beyond that, you are encroaching on my birthright. You are taking away from my existence as a live birth and a person who grew up in this country. I know no other land as a young man, as a young child. I know no other land. Someone else was responsible for that. You are taking away from the authenticity of my youth. person responsible for that was my parents. And the government at the day, the country, the state, instructed them by law they had to register me as a Caymanian. And when you question that, outside my parents' birth certificate and mine by virtue of them voluntarily registering me in a mandatory registration process, then you're walking on the wrong side of Arden McLean. And so should it be for all of us. The provisions for the Chief Immigration Officer to give you recognition as a Caymanian in the immigration law requires you to present to him the same birth certificates you would present to someone else, and he acknowledging it in a letter. That is the biggest piece of hogwash I've ever heard. Mr. Speaker, stupid. So I am challenging the government now to make that the next thing to be fixed. It is simple, Mr. Speaker, I said earlier, to become an elector or a member of parliament. You must be Caymanian. You must prove you are. So, Mr. Speaker, by extension, my elector card says that I'm Caymanian. That's blood ID. My elector's card. Now, Mr. Speaker, there may be those who say that there are a few of those who got on there before. Those are the risks we have to take. Maybe 50 of them, maybe 100. So what? They've been with us all their life. Mr. Speaker, any employer in this country who needs to know if you're Caymanian only need you to produce to them your elector's card, and they go up on the internet with their due diligence and see your name represented on the voter's registration. That's it. It's done. So the government, I'm asking the Premier and his government to now do a policy statement to these people. Make Caymanians feel like they are a part of their country. That's that little small step. That's all it takes. Well, maybe it's not that simple, but there are different scenarios that can identify Caymanians. Electors' cards, and I believe a policy saying forthwith, anyone holding these documentations can be considered Caymanian until we get a national ID or until it's further updated. The person who get it from immigration by virtue of grant or right, got a certificate. I got one too. I have one too. Birth certificate. And it means nothing? No. We need to. And I'm not, Mr. Speaker, I'm not arguing for the purposes of criticizing the government. I'm arguing for the purposes of putting a little urgency to this for the government. Mr. Speaker, Section 7 of this amending bill talks about categories of permanent residency. And given permanent residency, especially to the spouses of Caymanian, and in those instances, it's those who this Caymanian spouse have deceased. Mr. Speaker, I've had, I guess, as many as or more than many of my colleagues concerns and issues relating to Caymanian spouses with RERC, and the 7 years had elapsed, and within 2 months or so, the application was made. And the Immigration Board turned it down. Not the Immigration Board. The Immigration Department refused the application. And instructed the applicant to make an application for an extension of the RERC, and during the currency of the new RERC, then they can make another application for Cayman status. So when I talked to them, I asked, what evidence is there to suggest that the person would not receive it after being receive Cayman status after being issued the second RERC and during that, the currency thereof? And they say there's no evidence. The application is good, but it's just out of time. So I said, what are you going to do? Why don't you just make them have it now? Mr. Speaker, those are simple things that the law did not allow. And removing that 7-year period allows them to apply for it at any given time, because the other provisions are there where you have to prove that marriage is subsisting and whatnot and whatnot. However, there's another area that the Immigration Board, I hope, has stopped or are seriously considering a cease and desist order with. Mr. Speaker, the provisions for Caymanian status requires the board to ensure, to do due diligence and ask for, to see whether or not the person is financially able and what have you. And what they do is, on the application form, they ask, if you have been bankrupt, or any company you have worked for been bankrupt, and the creditors have not been made good, and if yes, yes or no, and if yes, explain. And at the end, there's a declaration on that form which says, any false information provided may result in you losing your status. That says to me that they're issuing it on the strength of the application form. Nevertheless, they write you a letter asking you to produce a bank statement to prove that you have never been bankrupt. Now, Mr. Speaker, haven't answered that question, I think it's question 19, in the negative. You're still asking the applicant to prove they wasn't bankrupt. A mere bank statement or letter from a bank of good standing does not verify whether or not you were bankrupt years ago. It just says that you're a customer of the bank. That's all that says. And then the other one they ask, which needs to be removed. Ask the Caymanian spouse, after 7 years, to prove that they can support their spouse. Really? Mr. Speaker, when was the last time the state asked anyone where they were living, how much they were making? If you were a Caymanian living in this country, the only time the state needs to get involved in that is when you go holding your hand out to them. The state or the immigration board has no business whether I'm living under thatch roof, zinc roof, seamless, or turtleback. They have no authority to ask me that until I go to the NAU. And in the absence of my weekly trip to the NAU, do not question me. Of course, you know, Mr. Speaker, I had to write a not too nice letter in that regard for myself and threaten to take them where they would have to be sworn. Across the yard yonder. Mr. Speaker, if that applicant and the Caymanian spouse has not made any false declaration therein, and has answered truthfully and said, and you get up the letters from the community saying that marriage is subsistent, and the couple, one signs and the other signs saying, this is my spouse and I am supporting this application for he or her to become Caymanian. That is all the board needs. And if it says, no, I have never been bankrupt, why are you asking me to provide that? Mr. Speaker, you understand, if the board knows something that was false information, they need to prosecute that couple, eh? They need to prosecute that couple because you just signed a declaration saying you wasn't giving them a false information. Mr. Speaker, that is why I keep saying that Caymanians, the member from Prospect talked about, and let me see the correct wording he used. Resentment that they are being left behind. These are the simple little things, like in this immigration law, that will allow them to feel a part of their country. It's simple, you know. They're simple little things. Mr. Speaker, you know, you have been in this business longer than I have. And I never reached the amount of time you're gonna. You can give, but you can't take back. The day you start threatening to take back or appear to want to take back is the day you demoralize a country and its people. That's true. Of course, our job is to give. What are we to give? Services, provide for services for the betterment of our people. And the day you start saying, retracting that, is the day you get in trouble. And the price you will pay is at the polls. Because the electors do not elect governments, they remove governments. They elect individuals, but they remove governments. I want those who hear me to think of that one. Mr. Speaker, I hope the mover of this amendment has some appreciation and understanding for where I'm going now. When my good friend, member from Savannah, brought the motion on equity for Caymanians' spouses versus those who receive residency by virtue of time and their spouses. When that was brought, my understanding of it was that there needs to be some equality or better for Caymanians. Provisions that make Caymanian spouses better off, because they being better off makes Caymanians better off. Two paychecks better than one. Two can make a family and we have more Caymanians. But with such immigration restrictions on that spouse with RERC, such as you can't open your own stuff, your own business, that kind of stuff, tends to reduce and take away from that entire family. And the intent really wasn't what the government has brought, albeit as an honorable position to take and try to correct in this manner. But I see what we're doing here. We're bringing it up to 8 years as opposed to 7. And we're putting the spouse to 8 years too. I was hoping so are we saying that was the discussion to come immediately following it, which is, are we saying that once you get RERC, the next day you can apply for status? Or, so why are we renewing it then? Mr. Speaker, somebody needs to clarify that for me. Because then we have removed all controls. There's nowhere in this world that you get your spouse and the day following receiving the right to work, you can become a citizen. Not even in the great America that happens. It takes a much longer process than that, as far as I recall. If such is the case, then I rest my case. Because if it is during the currency of that RERC, then I'm fine by that. Because it could be done in a year or whenever the spouse and the Cayman, the foreign spouse, expat spouse, and the Caymanian spouse so desire them. That's fine by me. It's fine by me. Well, that means you can't refuse giving those then on the basis of the immigration board has been using marriage of convenience. Because you try and control love over there too. Precisely. But there has been inordinate amount of delays in investigating such matters. So somehow that needs to be addressed. But I should point out to the Premier who just off mic said that a marriage of convenience is illegal. I should point out to him, all marriages are marriages of convenience. It was convenient for one to marry the other, and vice versa. Isn't that how it works?
I'm married for love, son.
You may tell me that it's illegal, but you can't tell me it's a marriage of inconvenience because it's illegal. It's especially inconvenience for your wife. But marriage is a convenience for both parties. So we need to find a different term to apply to it. To those who are marrying because they can pay someone to be able to stay here to be able to live here permanently. Mr. Speaker, I'll wait for the explanation on that one as to whether or when a Caymanian spouse, having been granted RERC, can apply for registration status and the likes and get their passport. Mr. Speaker, on the matter of Section 11 of the amendments, I too have had a number of these presented to me. And find it quite concerning to me in that if someone marries a Caymanian and has a child for that Caymanian, and for the purposes of this discussion, may I say we use a spouse, an expat spouse being a male. Mr. Speaker, there is a divorce. The marriage breaks down. The decree has been issued. The court has gone through. But during that marriage, a child is of that marriage. Now, it wasn't 7 years. For the purposes of this argument, let's say it was 5 years. Divorce, a child of 1 year. I wonder if anybody sees what happens. What happens, Mr. Speaker? By the time that child reaches 24, that Caymanian spouse would have been, if they married the day he came to Cayman, would have been in this country 28 years. What are you going to do with him at the end of that 28 years? That's the question we need to ask, because there's no provisions in here. There has never been any. We are allowing that person to remain on that RERC for 24 more years. Mr. Speaker, are we now saying that at the issuance, reissuance, renewal, whichever we want to say, of that RERC, or during the currency of the RERC, the person can apply for status? Is that the intent? I need to know. Maybe I'm seeing too far. Maybe I'm not seeing far enough. But I know right now of at least 2 cases where that male has gone on the basis of having been given up until that child is 18. I think a child like 4. So was that 14 years? RERC. Issued. Has gone on now and married another foreigner. Are we seeing the cycle, Mr. Speaker? That one then goes on, if divorce goes on, marry someone else. But had RERC, because of the RERC, to the person on the basis of their child, they haven't a Caymanian child. So there is a continuation of that lady's RERC then, because she'll marry somebody with RERC. I don't know the intent, but I know it needs to be corrected. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed. The other issue under this area is that of civil servants. They stay 8 years, and apply for status. And there's nothing in the law saying that they need to be here 8 years. However, I know of at least 2 people who was out of time. They 8, 9, whatever that is, in accordance with those who are here on work permit. That's what I'm relating that to. I trust the chief officer is listening closely. The person applies, but was out of time. No fault of his. It's just that he got sick just when he was supposed to, and then he was sick extensive. A very pivotal person in the civil service. It was refused because it was out of time. He didn't have any time to apply. There's nothing in the law saying he got to apply within that period because he's a civil servant. Then, when he asks when he can reapply, he has to wait another 9 years. You know how long he's been here then? 20 years. With nothing. Being worked to death by government and nothing. No working about that. You got him begging with cat o' nines on their back. Mr. Speaker, that needs to be corrected. I spoke to the Premier in September 2013 when we were amending the law with the tele-ups in the Eastern Civic Center, and I brought it to his attention, and it is now coming home to roost. You cannot. If that's the way we got to treat civil servants, let them know. Do not allow them, and this is for the civil service hierarchy. Yes, not for us. If that's the way we're going to treat civil servants, to allow them to be here for 20 years and have no security, then let them know before they sign that dotted line. Because I am sure there are many, like all the others, who come here, who would have come here expecting to see a short period of time, and it's all well and good for them. But I am sure there are those who come here knowing as much about this country as many others, who uprooted themselves from their country or origin or otherwise with the intent of wanting to stay here. Let's not be unfair to them. Some security of tenure must be offered those people. You can't tell them come and you got to wait till next mass status grant. That could be 50 years away. Gray Hill will be tripping them down before they get it. Mr. Speaker, I implore the government to address that matter with civil servants. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of the Refugee Protection Appeals Tribunal, I hear the Premier saying the separation thereof. And the UK has offered to train, I think, UN has offered to train. Yeah, there's one that was like Syria. Fool with them. Mr. Speaker, what the Premier didn't say, but is public knowledge, or at least many of us in the public know, that the tribunal wasn't handling all these refugees cases. And they were so delayed that they just granted them en masse. I applaud the government for separating it, but make sure it is done properly. We had ourselves in what a former member used to say in here in a tittle many years ago, when we found upon our shores visitors that we didn't know where they came from, that were claiming they were dropped off by ship and they swam in, and they came in by fishing boat, and they came in by plane, and we didn't know where they were from. That poses a serious threat to the security of this country. And whatever training the UN does, I implore the government to use it as training. Don't be influenced by the UN, because they'll have our stadiums fill up. That's a fact. That is their mission, to find countries who are receptive to taking refugees. That's their mission. And America don't want them. The closest country, they'll push them on. We have followed the news, Mr. Speaker, in the, but about the refugee appeals. Yeah, 84. We have followed the news, Mr. Speaker, of what's going on in the Mediterranean right now. We don't want to be caught in that situation. We really don't. Right or wrongly, incidentally or otherwise. It is, I know refugees have been contained to Cuba to the great extent, a greater extent, but let's try to keep it that way and process it as quickly as possible. And processing does not mean approving, because that's what has been happening with the Immigration Appeals Board. Many of us know. Mr. Speaker,
How much longer do you plan to carry on?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know. It could be a couple of minutes. Could be a little 15 minutes. How much time do I have? Nothing? 1 whole hour? Okay. No, Mr. Speaker, I don't think I will be very long, because I know you want to take a break.
Why I'm asking, because we've come to 6 o'clock and we take the evening break.
Yes.
But if you can finish in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, I will do that, Mr. Speaker. I'll do that, or shorter. And because a quick fire and a short 10. Mr. Speaker, I heard, and this is Mayor advice. I heard my colleague, the member from Prospect, talking about this new work department. And he was quite enthusiastic, I guess, because he has been involved in it for quite some time. And I applaud new politicians who, I was in his shoe one time too. And it was people like you, Mr. Speaker, who gave me the opportunity to be able to stand here today on my feet without a piece of paper. People like you and Linford Pearson and the rest, Kurt Tibbetts and whatnot. It's interesting to hear the intent of that work department. Whilst the member spoke extensively about service areas, jobs in service areas, elementary, craft, such as plumbing, mechanic, elementary, and caregiving, cleaners, service areas, and in hotels and security guards and stuff, I think it was. 70% of the work permits are made up there. 30% means it is in the area we need to take over. Not much was said about that. That is the area that the middle class comes from. Financial services, legal law, accountant, this, that. IT is called information technology. We have many Caymanians who are capable of working in that area and rising to the top. That has to have parallel priority by that work department. For too long, we have reduced ourselves to menial jobs. And to the member who has some little responsibility, not constitutional responsibility, like I hear you saying, who has little responsibility, and the Premier has given him some authority, so to speak, to have with policy. It is interesting. To him I say, time has moved on for him. He understands, or he's starting to understand the art of politics, which means compromise. But this immigration law needs to be amended to affect the top level too. We have too many Caymanians who are coming out of, if you want to call it Ivy League schools, or whatever, whether it's Ivy League or not. Good schools, good education, and there are people who are thickening the glass ceiling. And it must not happen under our watch. We must not relegate ourselves to bottom feeders. We must stop it. So don't speak with extreme emphasis on mechanics only, and don't talk about those at the top and the displacement of those who are not Caymanians by Caymanians. That needs to happen fast. I want you all to remember 8 and 9 in Tiananmen Square, China. What happened? Somebody needs to remember that. It wasn't the old people. They're only concerned about their pension now. It was the college students. Don't let it happen to us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, we shall take the evening break, and we should come back by 7 o'clock.